Hello, I'm Rob, and welcome to Alternatives To, where we look at an upcoming video game and suggest some alternatives that you can play in addition to, instead of, or even alongside the game that's coming out. Now, our suggestions might be obvious, or they might be a little bit left field, it all depends on the game. In this episode, we're looking at Little Nightmares 2, which is developed by Tarsier Studios and published by Bandai Namco. That's coming out on the PS4, PS5, Xbox One and Series X, PC and Switch. Now, before we go any further, I should point out that this is not a review. I repeat, this is not a review. So, where to begin? Well, Little Nightmares and its sequel are horror-based puzzle platform games with certain elements of stealth included in there as well. In the original game, you play as a yellow, raincoated young girl called Six, and you have to help Six escape from the maw. Tarsier Studios have said that the original game had the theme of greed, and the sequel will have the theme of escapism. The sequel is set in the decaying metropolis of Pale City, and Six, who has escaped from the maw, meets a young boy called Mono, who wears a brown paper bag as a mask. Apparently Mono does like his hats as well. He will have several hats throughout the game. Now, Six and Mono have to navigate through Pale City, which is inhabited by deformed, TV-addicted citizens. They have to reach the signal tower, which is operated and controlled by the mysterious Thin Man, who has influenced the city's populace with his transmissions. There are various locations throughout Pale City that you have to navigate, like the wilderness, the school, the hospital, and the signal tower, and there will be new enemies in each environment. When the original game came out, the art style reminded people of movies like Coraline. For me, it reminded me not just of Coraline, but an old 2009 CG post-apocalyptic film called 9, which was directed by Shane Acker. It also reminded me of a much older film from 1995, which was directed by Marc Caro and Jean-Pierre Jeunet, called The City of Lost Children, which ironically stars Ron Perlman. So if you fancy checking out that film, you should be able to find it somewhere. Anyway, the game itself, the original Little Nightmares, also had quite a few people saying, this reminds me of Limbo or Inside, both of which are games by Playdead. And yeah, I can see why people would immediately think of Limbo and Inside when they think of games that are similar to Little Nightmares. You could always go with something like Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons as well, which is developed by Starbreeze Studios. Or you could go with something like A Rose in the Twilight, which is developed by NIS America. So those sorts of games where it's a puzzle platformer with kind of a fairy tale horror type thing, or maybe a folktale horror aesthetic, those sorts of games really do seem like they fall into the same category of Little Nightmares. Maybe it's a subgenre of puzzle platformers, a developing subgenre of puzzle platformers. But anyway, leaving that to one side, let's get into my alternatives to Little Nightmares 2. And I'm going to start off with something from the left field. I'm going to start off with Oddworld New N Tasty. Not the original Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, but Oddworld New N Tasty, which is the remake of Abe's Odyssey that came out in 2014. It was developed by Just Add Water and published by Oddworld Inhabitants, and it came out on basically everything at the time. Oddworld New N Tasty is basically a puzzle platform game, but the strange thing is the original Abe's Odyssey is kind of the blueprint for what ultimately became Little Nightmares. Well, I wouldn't say it was the first blueprint, but more a revised blueprint of what ultimately becomes Little Nightmares in the future. And in a certain sense, you couldn't really have Little Nightmares without going through Oddworld. And I know that sounds weird now that I say that out loud. Anyway, pretty much anyone who plays video games knows the story of Abe's Odyssey. The Mudokon slave, Abe, is working late at Rupture Farms, a large-scale meat processing plant in Oddworld, and he overhears the plant's owner, the Gluckon named Moloch, in conversation with his fellow Gluckons. Because the animal meat is basically drying up, Moloch has the idea of using Mudokon slaves in a very Soylent Green type plot, but not Soylent Green as in their people, Soylent Green as in their Mudokons, and the Gluckons don't care. So Abe gets freaked out and decides to run away, which he does, but then he's tasked with saving the rest of the Mudokons. So Abe's Odyssey, which then leads on to Abe's Exodus, but Oddworld New N Tasty is my first choice for a lot of reasons. I think that the revamped, remade version of Oddworld New N Tasty, which was built from the ground up, it looks glorious, it plays wonderfully, and it is just such a good game to go back and play. Moving on to number 2, which is an unusual one because I could have easily gone with something like Limbo or Inside or any of the other games that I mentioned earlier. But instead, I'm going to go with a game that came out in December 2020 called Shady Part of Me, which was developed by Doze DCM and published by Focus Home Interactive, and features the vocal talents of Hannah Murray. Now, some people might look at Shady Part of Me and immediately think it reminds me of Contrast, which was out in 2013, developed by Compulsion Games. And in a sense, there are a lot of similarities with Contrast, but I think that as much as there are similarities with Contrast, there are also a lot of similarities between Shady Part of Me and Little Nightmares in general. In Shady Part of Me, you play as a little girl and her shadow who are overcoming emotional struggles through the surreal dreamscapes across a touching narrative filled with twists and surprises. That's according to the blurb. According to what I've played of the game, guess what? It's a joy. It is an absolute gem. I played Contrast when it came out, and I thought, this is a really fascinating idea. And what Doze DCM have done is take the idea from Contrast of me and my shadow, and they've really taken it and applied it to a surreal dream / nightmare where not everything is as it seems, and sometimes the only thing you can rely on is your shadow. Now, you can play around with the shadows, you can switch between 2D and 3D gameplay, and you can also, in a little bit like Prince of Persia Sands of Time, you can rewind time a little bit as well. You've got all sorts of environments that you can explore, and there's various puzzles to solve that will help you break the dream. It's a fascinating game that is a lot more complex and a lot more in-depth than you might actually realize. When you're playing the game, even though Limbo and Inside are wonderful games in their own right, I think Shady Part of Me is one of those games that really deserves a lot more attention, and is definitely a game that you can play either alongside or even instead of Little Nightmares 2, depending on what you prefer to do. So, moving on to my final pick, a game that used to be called Wick, but now no longer is called Wick, a game that is free to play on Steam. Yes, you heard it, it's free on Steam. It's a game that is short, it's only about, half an hour long? But you know what, this is a game that you can play in addition to Little Nightmares 2, it's a game that you can play in addition to Shady Part of Me, it's a game that you can play in addition to Oddworld New N Tasty, or Limbo, or Inside, or Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. It's a game that you can play in addition to all those other games, but it fits so well with Little Nightmares 1 and 2. It's developed by Studio Whip, and it is now called Flicker of Hope. And you play as a candle. That's right, you play as Jean Wick in his quest to restore hope to a dying world by carrying out a dead monk's mission to fill the cathedral with light. Now you have to navigate through this decaying cathedral and avoid the nun who has succumbed to despair and become kind of an evil ghost because she basically expended all her energy trying to heal the overwhelming tides of plague victims. And you also have to avoid the legions, the giant insects who feast on the dead and will attack any form of light. You have to travel through the darkness of the cathedral, lighting candles along the way, replenishing your wax, avoiding the nun, avoiding the giant insects, and avoiding all sorts of other obstacles like rain and big drops of water and things like that, because remember, you are just a candle. And you have to make it to the main altar of the cathedral and restore the light of the cathedral. And you know what? It's insanely good for the short runtime. It's exactly the same kind of game as Little Nightmares 1 and 2, but it's done so well. And Studio Whip, my hat's off to you for making the game free on Steam. It's a short game, it's a short experience, but it's a wonderful experience as well. The game is challenging in all the right areas, and it's just such a joy to play. And it's free, so if you have a PC that can run it, you've got no excuse. So, there's your three alternatives: Oddworld New N Tasty, Shady Part of Me, and Flicker of Hope. And the last two, I do hope you play them. Flicker of Hope is free, you've got no excuse. Shady Part of Me, you do have to pay for, but you know, it's the kind of game that deserves your attention. So anyway, those are my three options. Let us know what your alternatives to Little Nightmares 2 are in the comments below, because our choices are by no means definitive. If you liked the video, then give us a thumb, a sub, or a bell, and if you want to support us, then check out our Patreon. The details are in the description. If you're after more video game chit chat, then subscribe and join us every Thursday for Impossible Mission. That's all for this episode. I'll be back next time with some alternatives to Monster Hunter Rise, so that should be an interesting episode. Until then, thanks for watching.